Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and I am totally excited to share this new design with you, Bead Isle Cuff. I designed Bead Isle Cuff for my small knitted kit club, Lola's Choice. This was July's kit and pattern. It's pretty important for me to tell you that this is a companion video for Bead Isle Cuff, so you will need to have the pattern and or kit to follow along to understand what's happening in this video. I love shooting these because I kind of demystify any little tips or tricks, things that you need to know to have success knitting my patterns. Bead Isle Cuff is a new kind of exploration into beading for me. You know that I love to knit with beads, and I knit with beads on lace, and I'll knit with beads in jewelry. And now I took my passion and absolute love for Fair Isle color work and decided to try that out with my knitting. So I'm using colored beads that really contrast highly with my background yarn and playing with color work for these designs. I'm just checking my notes to make sure that I don't miss anything. So one thing that you should know about Bead Isle Cuff is that it is a long strip of knitting that is wrapped twice around your wrist. So in this video, I'm going to go over kind of some design inspiration and how I got into knitting Bead Isle Cuff. And then I'll go over the materials that you'll need for making the cuff. Then I'll talk about gauge and sizing your cuff. And finally, I'll teach you just a few knitting things you need to know, like how to place a bead, how to do a make one right and make one left. And then I think you're going to be good to go to make your own Bead Isle cuff. All right, let's jump right in. So inspiration-wise, I have this swatch, and this is sometimes what design looks like for me. I had a really fun session this spring where I played around with a lot of different yarns that I had in my stash and different colors of Delica seed beads. And I'm just gonna lay this down here so I can show it to you. I started off with some, I'm trying to see which end of this I started with. Yeah, I started off with some yarn that I got in Shetland. This is a Jameson 2-ply jumper weight yarn, and I'm placing Delica seed beads on here. And I really love the way this yarn behaves, but I found that the color of my beads was really getting lost for the patterning. I then went into a lighter weight Shetland jumper weight yarn and used a more contrasting bead, and I could really see that nicely. And then I played with some superwash yarn. Some of you might recognize this yarn I used in Kairos Cuff. It's from Emma's Yarn, and it's a hand-dyed superwash 100% merino yarn. And then I tried some other Shetland yarn, and here I was really playing with motif and playing with bead colors to kind of understand what was gonna pop on my yarn and what was gonna get lost. I tried some cotton yarn. I didn't really end up loving how that behaved. And then I tried some other Shetland yarn here as well. So that gives you an idea of what my design process looked like as I was playing with this technique. I ended up deciding to go with Emma's Yarn Basic Biddy, which is 100% superwash merino yarn. There's 43 yards on the skein. You're gonna use, even for the largest size, you're probably gonna use not more than 30 yards for making Bead Isle Cuff. The next thing I used was 3 colors of Japanese seed beads. And if you got from the kit from me, we packaged these up in a nice little tin. And what was the most important thing to do when I was choosing these beads is to make sure that they contrasted highly with the yarn. So I was really careful to make sure I had good contrast there. Next, you're going to need a clasp. I used a 2-strand, multi-strand slide clasp. So this clasp just pulls apart and pulls and goes back together like that. And it just gets sewn down to the back of your cuff right on each end. And I'll show you that again at the end of this video. Finally, your kit comes with a piece of super floss And what this super floss does is help you place the beads on your stitches. Alternatively, if you have a small crochet hook, I sell these in my travel beading tins, or you might be able to find one at your local yarn store. These are about a 0.8 millimeter to 1 millimeter crochet hook, and they are another tool that you can use for placing beads. I'll show you how to use the super floss and how to use the crochet hook when we get into the beading step of Bead Isle cuff. So now that we've covered that, let's look at gauge and sizing together. All right, let's talk about sizing and gauge together for Bead Isle cuff. As I mentioned earlier, Bead Isle cuff is a long strand that is wrapped twice around your wrist. So if you grab a measuring tape and you measure your wrist, choose a size on the pattern that is closest to your wrist size doubled. If you land in between, just go down a size because your knitting's going to stretch a little bit, and it will I think it'll wear better over time if you choose a size a tiny bit smaller than a tiny bit bigger. So my wrist is about 6 inches around, so I chose the 12-inch side. The sizing is made on your Bead Isle cuff by working extra ribbing rows before you jump into the color work chart. So every size works the same number of rows for the color work chart. It's just the ribbing at the beginning and the end that is longer. And what happens with that is you are twisting the cuff around the back of your wrist. And I've got some good photos I can show you to give you an idea of what that looks like on the back of your wrist. And then it clasps underneath the medallion that is on the front of your wrist. So that clasp is actually tucked in underneath. And what that does is kind of fill out that beaded medallion on the front of the cuff and really help it sit beautifully and not move around on your wrist. So you might be tempted to make this shorter and just have your clasp be right here. But when I tried that on a cuff, it actually ended up loosening up really quickly on my wrist and swinging around so that the clasp was in the front. And that didn't make sense to me because you really want that Bead Isle medallion to be like showing right there on your wrist. As for gauge, I know we're going to all be really tempted to not worry about gauge with a cuff, but you do want your cuff to fit, especially if you're gifting it to somebody. So your target gauge is 8 rows per inch blocked. And what I suggest to you is to start your cuff and work a bunch of rows and then stop and block what you have and see if you're getting about 8 rows to the inch. If you know that you knit loosely, just start with the needle size down. If you know you knit tightly, start with a needle size or 2 up and play around a little bit. If you're working with the kit, remember I told you that you have lots of extra yarn on this, so you might not need to take out what you've blocked and kind of reset that yarn. You could probably set that aside and start again and know that you have it if something happened and you needed more yarn. But I really think you've got enough on here to do gauge swatching and knit your cuff, which is really nice to have this much yarn in a kit for you. So that's pretty much what you need to know about sizing and gauge. And I think it is time to jump right in with a little bit of knitting so I can show you how easy it is to set up and work with those beads. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, let's get into the knitting bits. I've got a cuff already here, ready to work row 3 of the chart. So we're gonna look quickly at the chart together because there's 2 stitches on there. You will have already worked in the setup, but I'm gonna go over them with you right here. And that's a make one right and make one left. And then we're gonna learn how to place a bead with a crochet hook or with super floss. One thing when you're prepping for beads is you will see on your chart, and I'm just gonna grab it to show you, that you've got 3 different colors of beads that you're playing with. These are Japanese Delica seed beads. They're size 8. and they are a cylindrical bead, so they sit on the stitches really beautifully. You've got 3 different colors of beads: PBA, B, and C. PB stands for place bead. And if you want to prep your super floss ahead of time, you can actually pre-string your beads starting at the end of your chart and working back to the beginning of your chart, so that you end up with a strand of super floss that has all of your beads pre-strung on there in order, and that way you don't have to think about what bead you're grabbing next. Otherwise, you can grab each bead as it comes up on the chart and place that on a stitch. And I'm going to start out doing that with the crochet hook, and then I'll show you how to place a bead with super floss as well. So that's kind of a tip for those of you who like to prepare things ahead of time. So let's jump right in with row 3. One thing that it's important to remember with this chart is that right side rows are read from right to left, and wrong side rows are read from left to right. So if you're somebody who hasn't worked with charts a lot and you want to kind of double check yourself, I did write out everything for you as well in written instructions next to the chart. So you can use the chart to compare to the written instructions and vice versa if you get confused. All right, here we go with row 3. So I'm going to purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and now I'm going to make 1 right. So I'm going to take my left hand needle tip and go underneath this bar right here in between the stitches and put that onto the left needle tip from the back to the front, and then I am going to work through the front of that stitch. What's challenging here showing this to you guys is that it's small yarn and small needles, and I think I just split my stitch. There we go, that's going to be better. And that is a make 1 right. So I've twisted that stitch and I'm leaning to the right. And now I am going to knit 1. And now this next stitch, I am going to place a bead. So I'm going to use the crochet hook right now. I'm going to grab the bead on the crochet hook. I am going to go to that next stitch. I am going to slip that stitch off the left hand needle, slide the bead down onto the stitch, and then put that stitch back onto the left hand needle, and then knit that stitch. And that's a PBA, so I use the A color bead there. And now I'm going to knit 1 more stitch, and now I'm going to make 1 left. So I'm going to take the bar in between these 2 stitches. I'm going to put it with the front of the left hand needle going into that bar, and then I'm going to work that bar through the back, making a make 1 left. So that's a left leaning increase. And now I am going to knit 1 and then, purl 1 and then knit 1 and then purl 1. I went on automatic there. And that is the end of row 3. And now I'm going to show you row 4. Remember, row 4, you're reading back. So you're reading that left to right. And I'm going to knit 1, and then I'm going to purl 1, and then I'm going to knit 1, and I am going to purl 1, and then I am going to go get another bead, and I am going to put that onto the next stitch, and then slide that bead down, and I'll show you how to do this super floss with the next one. And then I am going to purl that stitch, and now I am going to purl that middle stitch. And now this next stitch, if you're working with super floss, let's look at how to do that. So I'm grabbing my super floss. I'm just going to move this other stuff out of the way to kind of keep things clean and easier for you guys to see. I am going to take the stiff tip of the super floss that's already pre-strung with all my beads. I've tied a bead onto the end down here so the beads don't go anywhere. And with the stiff tip end, I'm going to go into the stitch that I want to place a bead on. And then I'm going to fold the super floss back on itself and go get the first bead and slide it onto the super floss. So now I have 2 strands of super floss going through that bead right there. I've got the tip and the strand. And then I can slide that stitch off, slide that bead on, and then slide that stitch back on. So as you can see, that's a little more fussy to do. There's a few more steps than using the crochet hook, but it's pretty cool that you can preload it with all your beads in order and not worry about the color. The trick to that is to make sure that you've pre-strung your beads in order. So that's kind of up to you which you want to do. And now I'm going to purl that stitch and then purl the next stitch and then knit 1, purl 1, and knit 1. And that's really all of the knitting that I have to show you for this. I know this is a little harder to see because I'm working with smaller yarn and I'm working with those small size 8 Delica seed beads. I am using a quite sharp needle, which I think is really helpful for this. And the other thing that you'll notice that I did is I used a needle that contrasted with my yarn color a little bit, so it's easier for me to see my stitches. I'm really excited to see these come off of your needles. So once you've done all of that and you have finished knitting your whole cuff, we get to talk about finishing your cuff. So let's do that next. Okay, once you've finished your cuff, you do want to block it. If you don't block it, it's not going to look as good until you get all of those stitches to align with each other. So just soak it in a little bit of warm water and stretch it out. I love using my ironing board for jewelry. That's super easy to do. And then once it's done blocking, I think the thing that takes the longest with knit jewelry is sewing on your clasp. It's actually like crazy fast to sew on a clasp, but we can really procrastinate with that last step. I like to take things like that with me to my knit group because I find that I really like that sense of completion when I'm at knit night. Otherwise I end up like laughing all the time and not getting that much done. So if you bring like ends to weave in, clasps to sew on, that's a great thing to do when you're at knit group. What you're going to want to do when you go to sew on that clasp is just go to the back side of your work, and you can use that tail that you have on each end. You started with the tail and then you'll end with the tail. And you can use that tail to just whip stitch down your clasp to the back side. And you want to kind of set your clasp in a little bit so that you don't see it that much from the front. And you'll do that on both sides of your clasp, making sure that you sew them on so that you can line them up to slide together. And make sure that after you sew on the first one that you sew on the second one correctly. It's pretty easy to, by mistake, sew the second one on backwards and then they're both going in the same direction. That would be a shame. So kind of keep an eye on that when you're sewing them on. Remember to wear it that this is wrapped twice around the wrist, and then that clasp gets hidden behind the medallion. So if you're not super happy with how your clasp is sewn on, you don't even have to really worry about it because it ends up being covered up entirely. And then you have the really fun underside of your wrist where you have the beads on both sides right there kind of twisting underneath, which I really love that extra detail of the Bead Isle cuff. I'm going to admit to you guys that both my husband and myself want a both my husband and myself would really enjoy a beaded Fair Isle sweater. And I have an idea in my head. There's a piece of me, I get to go to New York State Sheep and Wool this year. And I kind of think that that would be really fun to be my Rhinebeck sweater. So if I have a goal, it is to have a beaded Fair Isle sweater knit for Rhinebeck. But we'll see if I can make a fingering weight sweater for myself in that amount of time. I definitely am not going to have time to also make one for my husband as well by then. So you might have to wait a few years for that. I'm also looking forward to playing with this technique in some other designs in the future. So if you aren't signed up for Lola's Choice, now is a good time to sign up for my small knitted kit club. Make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. My email list is an awesome way to keep up with what I'm up to. I'll always let you know when new kits are coming out, or I'm planning new travels, or what have you, right? Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave comments below. We'll have a knit along in my Ravelry group and in my Facebook group, and I am happy to help you knit your Bead Isle cuffs. Happy knitting!